Richard Wolffe is one of a very, very small handful of British journalists who defied the axiom that we are two nations divided by a common tongue and managed to prevail in Washington in no mean form. And besides having started out on the FT and all the other things which qualify somebody for greatness, he, as Newsweek's White House correspondent, had the dream of a lifetime, which was to be on the bus with Obama from the very beginning. And the book, which is a really excellent read and which is a plain person's guide to, he's not the plain person, we, the reader, is the plain person, guide to the thrills and spills of how Obama did it, is here in Renegade, and that's what we're going to talk about. But probably, I think, Richard, although we will talk a little about the book, which is, of course, why you're here, obviously we really want to try and extrapolate what you learnt on the bus to what is unfolding before us at this moment, because some of us have heavy and anxious hearts. You know, many of us lost our hearts to Obama. I feel from the book, to some extent, that you did too, and why not? I mean, I guess it first happened perhaps in 2004. You don't really talk about experiencing that speech that he made at the Democrat convention, but that was the first time he really hit the national and international radar at the Democrat convention.
Well, yes, that's true. Can I start by doing something very American, which is to thank everyone for coming and thank you for taking the time. Americans always like to start by thanking everyone.
And so. Can I say something very British? It's an honour, really, to be here.
And then can I say this is really embarrassing. I'm going to set aside the question of whether I lost my heart to any politician, but I will say that I was there for that convention speech in 2004, and I spoke to him actually the first time I met him the next day at a lunch that the Newsweek editors were having. The fascinating thing about that speech, apart from the fact that it was a great speech, was that it shut everybody up in the convention hall, because they just talk all the time. And you could hear, especially in these keynote speeches, you could hear all the conversation just suddenly fade away as this man commanded the room. And he was totally unknown. So the interesting thing was that he gave this wonderful speech, an impressive delivery, a total unknown. In theory, his message of unity was perfect for that convention, because John Kerry, advised by Bob Schramm, was trying to say, we're going to be positive. Voters, independent voters don't want us to go on the attack, even though we all hate Bush. And he was this guy, the most visible symbol of diversity for the party, and giving this incredible speech about uniting red and blue America. The next day, and actually around the same time, the thing that we as journalists were most interested in was that he was opposed to the war. And that was something that John Kerry wasn't prepared to say. In fact, it was actually quite difficult to understand whether John Kerry was for the war, against the war, which bit that he didn't agree with. And this is a mark of the guy's skill. A state senator out of Illinois opposed the war, but deftly sidestepping every question that every national reporter could throw at him about, did he support John Kerry? Did he not? And his answer was some artful response about, well, I was opposed to the war, but I didn't have all the intelligence. When it came back to the primaries, that was exactly what Hillary Clinton threw back at him, saying, well, given the chance to say you opposed the war, you hedged too. So it's funny how what seemed like political genius at the time also came back to bite him. That was a rambling thing. But look, the man had ability in spades, and he wrote that speech on his own without speech writers while he was watching a game of basketball. And you know, he said to me, he always knew what he wanted. That was a speech that he'd been preparing in his head for a long time.
And I mean, many would say he'd been preparing to run for the presidency for a very long time. It's just, as you point out in the book, that it came earlier than...
Much earlier
than he expected.
Now, yeah, my old friends at the Financial Times think I'm terribly naive for saying this, but I talked to just about everybody involved in the planning for his campaign, and there were no serious plans. There may have been an ambition at some stage to be president. I have no doubt about that. But there's a huge difference between wanting to be president and actually putting the pieces together, because it's so enormously challenging without a name, without a network, without money.
I'm interested that you, with your unmistakably British accent.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, I mean, but it must have been interesting to him, because, I mean, you know, he came from Illinois. He was a man of diversity. He was a man with this extraordinarily complex background. And it's clear that he had no objection to the accent at all, unlike, you know, some elements of the Washington establishment. And you developed a friendship with him, but not a close one, it would seem. I mean, in the sense that I don't think anybody has developed a close friendship with him, but certainly nobody from the media.
Well, yeah, I don't think. Look, we had a rapport, certainly. I wouldn't count myself as a friend. I think there's something opaque and hidden about him, actually, and reserved, in some ways quite British. And that's, in a way, why I wanted to write the book. There was this question about who is Barack Obama, and people on the right would say this is a sort of spooky type of thing. What's he trying to hide? It's also relevant because he had a very thin resume before running. But this kind of withdrawal, this hiding yourself away, intrigued me, and I thought he needed to have his story told by someone other than him. Well, so that's what I tried to do.
The two moments in which that suspected darkness emerges in the book is clearly one, the Reverend Wright, which is a period which, as you described very well, in which the whole thing came very close to coming adrift altogether.
Yes.
And the other, which you don't dwell a lot on, but you bring in from time to time, is the business of Bill Ayers. I'll start with them in chronological order. I mean, Bill Ayers, I know very well, and I've known him for about 20 or 30 years. He's a Weather Underground character, and I came to know him because I knew Kathy Boudin's father, and Kathy Boudin was another Weather Underground person who's just come out after 21 years in jail. And I mean, Ayers was potentially extremely dangerous, but very, very close to Obama. Closer, I think, than people like to admit. Well, lived in the same street, operated in the same quadrant. You know, you say he only popped round sort of occasionally, but
well, no question they moved in the same circles and sat on a board together. Was he a friend? Was he a confidant? I'm not sure that he was a confidant, but they certainly knew each other pretty well. What's interesting, well, this tells you how sensitive they were. I was in the room where it was a school gym, where Obama was voting on election day, and as I described in this book, this schlubby guy walks in, and I'm looking at him thinking, that's familiar, and I really know nobody who lives here. And I lean over to someone sitting next to me and I say, isn't that Bill Ayers? And suddenly all the reporters go crazy. And I have to tell you, the reaction from campaign headquarters that A, that he was there, B, that I'd been the one who identified him. I mean, they were pretty furious. And they made the joke, one of them quipped that it was the bar in Star Wars at the end of, you know, that this was a sort of freak show that was going on. The danger here was that Bill Ayers, although he'd become this sort of education expert,
a guru, a real guru, I mean, very, very accomplished fellow,
was that he would make Obama seem radical, which actually he really isn't.
But actually, Jeremiah Wright was far more dangerous.
Far more dangerous.
And Obama knew full well what Jeremiah Wright represented. And actually, oddly enough, if you deconstruct what Wright said, much of it was pretty well true. The only problem was the way he said it.
The way he said it. Well, yes.
I mean, that's often the case, isn't it?
You know, he knew that Wright was explosive. His friends knew that Wright was a ticking time bomb. he asked his staff to, as I tell in the book, to go research all the sermons and find out what was going on.
Sermons he'd sat through for 20 years.
Well, sermons, yeah, but the thing is that he actually hadn't been to church as much as he pretended. And he was a man who...
I was caught between I am a church-going person, but I've never listened to the sermons.
Right,
yeah.
right. How do you explain that? How do you say, I've written a whole chapter in my book, The Audacity of Hope, about how Democrats need to understand churchgoers and how I'm a member of this church, but actually most Sundays for the last 4 or 5 years, or even more, I've been campaigning for votes in various churches around the state and not going to my own. They were really embarrassed by that. But look, he knew that Wright was politically provocative and had a way with words that would that was outrageous. I mean, all his friends would say, look, the point about Wright being outrageous was that if he was outrageous, then whatever was going on in your life on the south side of Chicago would seem less out of the norm. So that was the culture of the church, politically connected, culturally sophisticated, and Wright's extremely erudite, but especially when it comes to Jewish interests, for instance, really quite offensive, never mind what he says about terrorism.
Well, bits of the book are going to weave into the conversation, I've no doubt, but what I want to do really is to trade on you being here to bring us up to date.
Yes.
Because we have a situation in which he's going to make one of those life-saving speeches on Wednesday to try and get himself out of the tremendous hole that he's in on health reform. I mean, he's closer to health reform than any president's ever been, so that's the plus. But what I think surprises many people is that the great plus of the campaign, beyond the identity of the man himself and what he brought, was the nature of the online, the sort of viral aspect, which nobody had ever seen in a political campaign on that scale before. Pache Dean, I mean, he got it going, but it was nothing like this. And yet, that tool, which would be so brilliantly useful in a domestic crisis like healthcare, seems to be nowhere. And instead, the right are running rings around him. The shock jocks have him establishing systems for killing people. You know, death panels. You've got Carol Sikora, a British cancer specialist, wheeled out to say how evil the NHS is. You have poor old Stephen Hawking risen from his chair to tell us through his now newly reformed voice box that the NHS is the only thing that saved him, after the right had said that had the NHS been looking after Hawking, he would have died. So he had to come out and say, well, actually it was the NHS that has looked after me, and that's why I'm alive. I mean, it is an amazing thing to see him with his back against the wall, because he hasn't got what he had in the campaign. Where's it gone? What's gone wrong? Who's to blame?
The online thing is interesting. They've never found a way to really control that or use it with all the constrictions that you have in the White House. So certain political activities have to be kept at a distance. The technology doesn't work in the same way. I mean, it really is, they're working with pretty basic Dell computers as opposed to what they had. Not that it's that sophisticated to run this kind of thing. I think their immediate concept was that they needed to run Washington expertly. So he had to transition from being the outsider to being an insider very quickly, which is why you end up with a White House chief of staff like Rahm Emanuel, the consummate insider, been in the White House, knows how to run things in the House of Representatives. But that's a very different spirit. And they neglected it, quite honestly. The pattern of falling behind, losing the message war, and then having Obama himself rescue them with a big speech is one that they repeated time and again through the campaign. He did it early in the primaries, he did it late in the primaries, he did it through the general election, he did it with Reverend Wright, pretty much over and over again, and he's done it in the White House. And it comes back to, I think, this image that one of his friends told me about, that he is, in basketball terms, a fourth quarter player, and it's the last minute of the fourth quarter when he really steps up his game, because there's something deeply competitive about him that sets aside the policy wonkishness, the multiple focus that he has, and that's when he brings out the best.
But in this moment, when he reaches for the rhetoric, when he reaches for the things one never thought to hear an American president say, which sort of bring joy to Americans and non-Americans alike. I mean, the Cairo speech, you know, which did the same.
Right.
The race speech, which did the same. I take absolutely what you're saying. But at what point then does that have to be met by compromise, pragmatism, all the other things?
Look, he's an incrementalist. He's a compromiser and an incrementalist. So this version of healthcare reform is not the Democrats' long-held dream. He doesn't use the words universal healthcare. Just doesn't say it. This is not a repeat of what Clinton was trying to do, not just because of the scale of it or the secrecy with which the Clintons approached things. This just isn't the core Democratic project. This is a piecemeal effort, a big piecemeal effort on a number of different areas to reduce cost, to extend the reach somewhat, and to hold out the option. They've talked about a public option. It's going to be an option rather than the public plan. So I think a lot of Democrats are going to be disappointed. And I think, by the way, this is going to be the first phase. They won't say this, but I think they're going to come back and do it again in a couple of years. And that way they may get closer to the end goal. But the vagueness that everyone is criticizing now will actually be his saving, because he can come out of this saying, I did it. And in the end, no one's really tracking the back and forth like we are.
Well, I mean, that is a very domestic thing, and although we look on in some ways with superiority, but also anxiety because we're already bankrupt ourselves. But anyway, we look on with some superiority, which we like doing to Americans, and find it difficult to find moments to do it.
Yes.
But that intrigues us for that. But it also intrigues us because it tells us a lot about how Obama works. The real anxiety, it seems to me, about Obama, and many people who are very concerned with civil rights and liberties and the rest of it are concerned about, is one, the Afghan war,
yes,
and two, Guantanamo. And on Guantanamo, if we look at that first, which was one of the things where he was absolute.
Yep.
He said, I'm going to close it. I'm not going to use these legal devices because they're illegal, unconstitutional. And he's drifting on closing. He's 6 months behind schedule. And he is compromising, that's not too strong a word, compromising on the application of legality. And people think he's backsliding.
Yes.
Is he, well, or is this incremental, as you put it?
There are two pieces of Guantanamo which I think are, and let's just extend it from Guantanamo to the whole detention, interrogation, the whole thing, because you've got to take in the secret prisons and torture. And I think on torture, actually, this is really the kind of change that people thought he would represent. Not just saying no torture, but actually investigating it. And I think it's pretty predictable there will be prosecutions coming out of this. So that's quite dramatic, actually, and unthinkable for a Republican administration, and certainly any form of the Bush administration. Preventive detention, indefinite detention, is most definitely not what he discussed, hinted about. He taught constitutional law. And you can find corners of the American Constitution under certain interpretations which would allow, in certain circumstances, presidents to have those powers in times of war, but to stretch it indefinitely really smacks of the Bush era. And I think what you have there is, again, this outsider who's trying to be an insider, who's suddenly getting the briefings, feels that he's commander-in-chief, and has a responsibility. And the problem, and this is a live issue here, alongside the personal responsibilities he has, they also know that they have people they're convinced are guilty, whose evidence is entirely tainted by torture, which they oppose. And what do they do about them? What do they do about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who it would be hard to make a claim for his innocence, given his status within al-Qaeda's leadership. But he was waterboarded many, many, many times. So under any normal court of law, he would be freed. That evidence couldn't be used. Now, could they construct a system? We don't know what they're going to end up with. Could they construct a system whereby, rather like Al Capone, they get him on a lesser charge and lock him up for life? Well, they probably could. And I'm perplexed as to why that hasn't emerged as an option for them, as a legal option.
I confess, I wake up in the morning and in my bath, I'm an apologist for Obama as I think about the day and what we're going to do about it. Because, of course, obviously, as a hack, one is saying this is obviously running amok. This is not what he said he would do. But the apologist in me, and I'm wondering whether this is at all true, suggests that what we're really seeing in the limits of power to what we thought was an unlimitedly powerful job, that he's arrived in the White House, and just as you describe, he's been unable to reform the computer system for running his, his viral activities. He cannot get hold of the levers of power that would sort Guantanamo out. You should be able, if you say, I want to shut it, I want legality, you should be able to say, you, and you, deliver me that in 3 weeks. He hasn't.
And I don't think it's the levers of power, to be honest. You know, one thing that he would campaign against, actually rather effectively, was what he called the politics of fear. And to some extent, 2008 was with Democrats and American voters saying we're not going to be scared. The scare tactics that worked so well in 2004 and 2002 are not going to work anymore. I think the politics of fear actually weigh heavily on him in the White House. Freeing terrorists, quote unquote, is still politically fraught, and that's a limitation on power. That's a self-imposed limitation on power. Although I will say, for a handful, maybe a dozen, 2 dozen of people they are pretty well convinced are actually responsible for at least a conspiracy to commit mass murder. The evidence is tainted. What do you do about those people? But that's a fairly small group that does not take in large numbers of people in Guantanamo. So I share the concerns, but I think they're constricted by political caution more than not knowing how to operate the administration.
I want to open this up very soon because I know loads of people have got lots of questions in which they'd like to take in different directions. But I'd like to talk about the war because they didn't elect him either to run a war. But of course he inherited a war. Now you have a very interesting situation in which you have Obama, who was against the war in Iraq, okay on the war in Afghanistan, but had no great strategy for it. And you have Brown here, who had no enthusiasm for the war but did nothing to stop it and wasn't particularly interested in working out the sums for how much it would cost. And so you've got these two leaders who in a sense have been inflicted with having to fight this war. And Obama, for the moment, seems completely to have absorbed all the previous rhetoric and kind of reasoning and the rest of it, and simply to be carrying on more or less in the same vein, extending it a bit into Afghanistan, into Pakistan, but now a war president. And he's the only man ever elected to the White House who actually stood up on a platform and said he was actually against one war and not exactly the greatest fan of the next.
Well, he was certainly no fan of the war in Iraq. That's absolutely true. He didn't believe the rationale made any sense. And that it would backfire. I mean, he was pretty accurate in his predictions, but actually he's always been, he's thought Afghanistan was neglected. So what you've seen is a corrective measure, much more emphasis on development aid, which is difficult to deliver, but still actually spending money that the Bush administration really didn't commit. The question comes down to, as they grapple with questions of troop increase, what kind of commitment is that? How long is it going to be, and what's the end game? Do they have an end game? I think you're going to see someone who is much more ready to increase troops and declare victory and pull out, as opposed to what characterized Bush's approach, which was a really quite stubborn insistence that you needed to have a fully functioning democracy before anything like victory could be declared and withdrawal could begin. The thing that matters to him is counterterrorism and striking at core al-Qaeda leadership. But you can do that without having a large imprint, and that's exactly what Gates has been saying. What the Defense Secretary is saying is that if you have a big footprint, does that actually make the nation-building piece of it more difficult? And do you need that anyway to have the drone strikes on your suspects? So it's a difficult one. I spoke to someone in the White House just yesterday about it. They said he wants to thrash this out. He wants to see it thrashed out. Presidents, and especially this guy, only tend to do that when they've already made up their mind. I mean, they're testing themselves. It's not like they've got a really open mind about it. I suspect he's going to increase the troops, but this will be a 1-2 year commitment, not a 4-8 year commitment, because, look, it started out as a just war and people were prepared to stick with it, but it's been going on a very long time.
And does he at the same time manage to get out of Iraq?
Well, if getting out of Iraq means leaving 50,000 advisors, counter-terrorist force, and some sort of hair trigger against bigger ethnic sectarian violence, yes, he'll get out. But the Americans got out of Germany and Japan and South Korea, and they've still got several thousand troops in each of those countries.
Well, look, before I open it up, the last thing I want to talk to you about is the people he surrounded himself with.
Yes.
Because that's another area of controversy. I mean, there are many who view Larry Summers as, you know, one of the agents of our present grief, and yet there he is at an absolutely pivotal place in the economy. There are others within the team that are not seen as the most exciting and acceptable people on the block. Did those appointments surprise you, or I mean, in fact, the appointments render him, I would have thought in many people's book, a very, very conventional president.
Yes, I think that's true. I think again he was looking for people who knew where those levers of power were. I mean, you can make a stronger case that Tim Geithner at Treasury is more of an architect of the current situation, since he was intimately involved in the bank bailout policy, which is so loathed in America. I think there's actually going to be a large turnover in the people around him.
You think Summers will go?
I don't know about individuals as such. I think for a start, there's a huge risk of burnout. They're trying to move incredibly quickly on a vast range of issues, and the pace they're working, especially for people who are on the campaign, is inhuman. I think, again, this man is the anti-Bush, okay? Instead of being stubbornly wedded to people around him and saying, I want people to stay forever, I want their loyalty forever, he's going to be kicking people out and moving on to refresh himself, refresh everyone around him. I suspect we'll get to the year stage, the 18-month stage, and there will be a really quite major overhaul. So is it Larry, is it Tim, is it someone else, is it going to be Rahm? It could be all of them. I suspect that, you know, a year or two out from the next election, his next election, not the midterms, you'll see an almost completely different White House. He's
a remote fellow in the end, isn't he?
He is. He is. That's the challenge for any writer.
The only people in there, really, are the girls, the wife.
Valerie Jarrett, family friend.
Yes.
And
yes, you write very well of the immediate
advisor. Friends.
You've clearly...
David Axelrod is a friend, as well as being a senior advisor, but there are very few. There are very, very few. And
it's a heck of a lot for a bloke to sustain. I mean, if this was called The Ascent of Man instead of Renegade, you know, we would have seen a graph which went like this and reached incredible heights in victory.
This is someone who had never been at the front half of Air Force One. He had never been in anything but the public rooms of the White House. Honestly, he really didn't know what he was getting himself into. And he didn't know what really life would be like as a candidate. I mean, he'd heard about it. His aides had said, you're going to hate this. Why are you doing this? You're crazy. And he hesitated deeply before he ran. He's a very cautious man, but he takes these big gambles. Honestly, you know, one of his aides said that when he got into the race, it was like throwing a man into ice cold water. And I think the presidency has been much like that too. The benefit for him is that he's finally living with his family. For the first time, actually since his children were born, he's actually spending his weekdays where his children are, because he would normally only come back at weekends. That's the one benefit of it. The rest of it, I think, is quite frustrating. It's a gilded cage. You cannot walk around freely, even within the confines of the White House. And the burdens on him, look, when I saw him in February in the Oval Office for the last interview I did for the book, he was aging rapidly as a candidate, going grey, the lines on his face, the bags under his eyes. It had accelerated even within 2 months of taking office. So,
but no fat.
No, that's true. That's true.
No mean achievement. Richard, I want to open it up to the floor on that rather banal observation from me. Yes, why not? Start.
In the context of Wright and Ayers, I'm surprised you didn't mention Rashid Khalidi, actually, also. But that's not the question. That fourth...
Is that working? We've got to be very close to it, I think.
Am I not? I don't know.
Right into it.
The fourth quarter question
yes.
Raises what I think is the great issue of this, is strategy and tactics. And that also involves what happened to Carter and Clinton. I see David Brooks yesterday is already becoming savage on the question of the midterm elections and how many people the Republicans could gain, which would actually, I don't know, in my view, would put Obama would be dead in the water if he loses the majority in Congress. So imagine that he's just coasting now, and yet he's gone across this vast spectrum of, and there has been speculation from Rahm Emanuel that he's done the vast spectrum because that means the Republicans can't fight him, because they can't cover so many spectrums at once. And so if there's a strategy for Afghanistan in the fourth quarter, whatever, who is designing this strategy? Is this coming from Axelrod and the Clinton people, or is, if there's a long-term, for example, I said in an interview that I thought it was an exit strategy, that he will increase in Afghanistan, as you said, and wait till the Republicans want him to get out, and when he's got that kind of consent, then he can get out. But who's actually controlling all of this? You've been watching him, and you described Obama as a lonely person. But I suspect there are people around him who are very, very smart, and they're walling him in against the kind of attacks that can come before the midterms. How much danger is he in the midterms? How much danger is he in 2012? I think those are the questions that you particularly might be able to answer.
Lots of stuff in there. Let me say that I think the critical factor in the midterms and in his re-election is the economy. So all the questions about Afghanistan and the strategy and healthcare, all of those things are important. But unless people feel the economy is getting better, no matter what the statistics say, he will lose significant seats in the midterms and may lose re-election. Now, the statistics suggest that actually the economy is coming back pretty well. But again, it matters what people are feeling, especially when it comes to employment, especially if wages are, healthcare is relevant to the economy, because if, as we've seen in recent years, every increase in wages is consumed by higher healthcare costs, then people actually feel poorer. Who's crafting the strategy? Well, Rahm is incredibly influential in terms of the amount they're doing that quickly, and that really comes from his character. He is, I don't even think he's borderline ADD. He just is. He's incredibly hyperactive, and his theory is if you're doing everything, then people, A, give you credit for doing everything, and B, your opponents can't possibly respond, as you point out, to everything you're doing. And you fill the vacuum, and if you don't fill the vacuum, someone else will. That's fine in a crisis, but it isn't always a crisis. And the danger is, as we've seen with healthcare, that doing too much at one time means that you're not making policy decisions in any coherent way. And on top of that, I actually don't think the core group is that good at making decisions. One of the problems about how they framed healthcare is that for all the brainy, well-plugged-in, vastly researched advice that they get, they haven't wanted to exclude any one thing. The reason they haven't been able to say what healthcare means to people is because saying one thing means rejecting all the others. They're at the point where they have to actually define what they're trying to do. Are they extending healthcare to the uninsured? Are they reducing costs? What is it? If they don't define it, then actually there's a vacuum, even though there's lots of activity, and the vacuum is filled by people saying it's about death panels or socialized medicine. So those communications flaws are easily papered over. The strategic flaws are easily papered over when things are going well. They're actually papered over when you have a wonderful principal who can give a great speech and has popularity and can pull things out of the bag at the end, in the fourth quarter. This is testing them in a different kind of way. In the end, I do think the economy is the key thing. Afghanistan, look, it's not going to get resolved by 2010. It may be winding down by 2012, but they do not approach the military part of this by saying they need to win against the Taliban. Already they have framed a solution, as it were, by saying they're trying to peel off parts of the Taliban that renounces al-Qaeda or is willing to turn over al-Qaeda. They're putting money, to the extent that they can actually deliver any of it, into development projects, infrastructure projects. Nobody is saying, as the Bush administration did, this is going to be won by finding by a counterinsurgency strategy that kills all the enemies. They're not doing that. So I don't think they're boxing themselves in that way. I think actually they're leaving themselves open to a fairly rapid exit.
Is there acknowledgement that the Taliban is actually already in control of the country? I mean, David Kilcullen was.
The question is, yes, pieces of the Taliban. Which part of the Taliban? They've come to either the political frame or the understanding that the Taliban isn't a coherent group. So depending on your expertise about the Taliban, you can agree or disagree. Who's guiding the strategy? Well, events will, in the end, define it.
Let me bring in some other questions. Felicity.
I just wanted to ask about how far Obama has managed to change Washington, if at all. That was one of his key pledges during the campaign, that he was going to be a different kind of politician. Now, obviously, once you're in power, you find out that getting anything through Congress involves endless horse trading. Does this mean it's impossible to change Washington? I'd like to, if you've got any examples of where things have or haven't changed, and whether you think he could actually do anything, in the time he's got.
I asked him quite a lot in the course of the election about what he meant by change. And I had this long interview with him once where he talked about basically the process, bringing kids in, inspiring new people to get involved. And he did all of that. And it was right at the end of the interview that he sort of pulls me back on the plane and said, oh, yeah, but I really want the change for healthcare and jobs and better schools. So changing Washington there were always different elements to it. I think he certainly brought people into the election process. There's no question about that. People were involved in a way that they had never been before, and young people were certainly engaged in a way they hadn't been. That, as we've discussed, has really not, it's not feasible to continue it in Washington. They have no role, they have no input, and they didn't really try that hard either. Certain policies have changed. I mean, they're spending a huge amount of money that actually they don't have on classic liberal economic policy, on infrastructure spending, which allows them to do all sorts of things because they haven't actually spent most of that money, and a lot of it just happens to be heading out the door in election year. And then there are key things that have changed. And I think the torture piece of it, the concrete plan for withdrawal in Iraq. But changing the way of Washington, it has caught them in a bind here, because one thing that he would campaign very strongly against was the access of lobbyists and corporate interests in Washington. They've never really defined terribly well what the red line was around corporate interests. Who what constituted a lobbyist was sort of, it should be very clear from the law as it's written. But Tom Daschle, who was a friend of Obama's, his first nominee to be health secretary, was kicked out for his corporate activities, but was never a lobbyist. And what you now have, because of the law, is a lot of people who are registered lobbyists who are effectively excluded from all sorts of jobs and everything else, but are playing by the rules, and a lot of unregistered lobbyists who are in a grey area who are not. So it's almost like prostitution. I mean, they've sort of driven it to a different place. Now, I don't want to be pessimistic about this, because I actually don't think that the corporate influence on the White House is really that material. The corporate influence on lawmakers is actually much more pernicious. And none of that is really going to stop, whether you're registered or unregistered. The question is whether you have politicians who have the backbone and the principle to set those interests aside. Those interests are going to exist anyway. Can I give you a concrete example of how that's happened? Well, I don't think that the corporate interests in the healthcare debate are having a very good time of it. The ones who are supposedly for healthcare reform are finding that they're being forced to commit to large cost savings to get their photo ops with the president. And those who are not in favor of it will end up as sort of regulated utilities, and that's where the insurance companies are headed. So I don't know that if you ask the US Chamber of Commerce, is this administration favorable for them? They would say yes. In fact, they are some of the most determined opposition is coming out of that. So, in fact, I'll tell you, some of the people who are in those photo ops are also funding the Chamber of Commerce behind the scenes to sort of campaign against him. It's a very unsettled picture when it comes to corporate money in Washington.
But that, of course, is the nature of Obama too, isn't it? People want to be photographed with him, even if they're campaigning against him.
Well, that says his popularity is still pretty high, yes. Yeah.
Although, technically, it's very low, isn't it?
Well, you know,
hasn't it taken the sharpest fall any president has had in the history of polling?
Yeah, but I also remember in my days on local newspapers, we would say we'd have the sharpest rise in circulation ever, which meant that we were starting from a very low base and had gone higher because we cut the price. He had this tremendous peak from election day to his inauguration, and there was this euphoria about the inauguration. And I was talking again to some White House folks about this just the other day. He's come down from those stratospheric heights where 80 to 90% of America were waving flags, feeling good about themselves about having the first black president, and that historic moment. He's gone back down pretty much to where he was on election day, which is a steep decline, actually. It is a very steep decline, and anyone who says in the White House that they're happy with that is lying. On the other hand, this is the worst economy for whatever it is, 80 years, and to be there with positive ratings when everyone else is deeply negative ratings is itself actually quite substantial.
Right. Yes, let's take you here.
Hello. Do you have a sense of what is most important to him as a man and as a politician? What really motivates him? Given that he has this extraordinary range, these extraordinary abilities. On the one hand, he can function as, he can sort of carry the symbolic burden of presidency, inspire people, convey values, excite people at that level. On the other hand, he's a very intelligent man. He's literate. He's capable of working in committees, it seems. Do you have a sense of him that he uses that capacity to function at a symbolic, inspirational level as an instrument, as a means for pursuing his goals, which in fact, that behind that, he is a cautious person who's concerned with policy content. He's a strategist. He's got a set of commitments that he wants to implement that in some way differ from this more inspirational figure that he presents himself as periodically? I mean, or is it this inspirational side of him, which is the real him and what motivates his interest in politics, and the actual more contentful side of it is essentially delegated to people around him?
Well, let me take this back. It's a great question. Let me take this back to his days as a community organizer, because I think that's a key to understanding him as a politician. He dreamt, quite literally, of the civil rights movement. He knew that he was too late for it. But that's what he really wanted to relive. The community organizing movement, though, hated the civil rights movement. Saul Alinsky, who created community organizing, modeled it on the unions and on labor organizing, and was much more cold about how you organize, about what an organizer should do. Obama mixes the two together. He knows that you have to be methodical. He knew, as an organizer, he had to be methodical, diligent, that it was all about small steps along this greater path. But he also knew that the civil rights movement had this unique ability to inspire people, and that it was the inspiration that led to the change in America, not actually the dull work of organizing. And as a politician, he's had those two things going, which I think you're getting to very well with your question. Personally, the way he talks about his speech making and the inspirational qualities, it's very much as a tool. He knows that he can turn it on or off. The question is, does he want to? Is it appropriate? Is it cheap? And that, by the way, is extended through his speechwriting team. And I recount in the book how the most inspirational speech that he had in the entire election, "Yes, we can," was a phrase that actually his main speechwriter rejected out of hand when one of his own deputies said, "We should use this." Obama had used the phrase in a debate in New Hampshire, and they loved it. And the speechwriter said, "No, we're never going to use that. If we use that, everyone's going to chant, 'Yes, we can.' I'm not going to have that." And there is a resistance. They know that he can do it. He knows he can do this stuff, and he constantly pulls back. And in a way, that's actually a bit like, in some ways, the major source of his inspiration, which is his African-American identity.
But just there, this business of knowing that he can do it, one of the extraordinary things about the debates was he never did it. He was really dull and disappointing in the debates. If he could do it, why didn't he do it?
Well, in the primaries, he was deeply disappointing in all the debates, because he was lazy, actually, and disdainful of the process. He thought, for a start, he didn't prep for it, didn't do his work. When he did prep, he complained about the debate format. There's a certain arrogance to that. There's a certain sense that I don't need to play by the rules because these rules are stupid. Well, yes, until you look foolish and you actually have to play by the rules. Now, he would, and did explain to me that his thinking was, well, as a legislator, my whole political thing had been to find common ground. So I would be there in these debates, finding the common ground. Actually, that's the opposite of what you want to do in a debate. In a debate, you want to find the points of difference. You want to be a prosecutor, not a professor. When it came to the general election, he knew that he couldn't resist anymore, and he worked incredibly diligently and tactically on everything, on the way he held his head, the way he mastered his policy book. Again, he did it at the last moment, the very last moment. But there's something really cold about knowing that you can inspire people and choosing not to do so. Joe Biden said at one point that he had whatever it was, steel in his veins. There is something to that. And this gets back to him locking up his emotion. He is emotional. He does have emotions. I've seen them. He can get impatient and angry and crabby and tired, irritable. He can also cry, actually. I've seen that too. Not as much as him being irritated, I have to say. He hasn't cried at me, but he has been irritated with me. The cautious piece of it is much stronger for him. Here is someone, and I'm going to relate it back to, look, I wrote this book as biography, campaigner's biography, not just a sort of election book. Because here is someone who is uniquely exposed. You never get this kind of exposure ever again. When they're presidents, they can hide behind the security and the speeches, and it's much more raw when they're candidates. They never get to be these candidates ever again. They don't screw up in the same way. It's not so open. So the biography piece of this is important to understand, because you've got to understand just how dysfunctional his family life was. Here is someone who didn't know his father. His mother left him not once but twice, sent him off to Hawaii. I mean, his mother was really a hippie kid. You know, teenage mother, pregnant at 6 months by the time she got married to this guy from Kenya, never going to last, married another foreign student a couple of years later, took the family, young son, to Indonesia straight after a coup she knew nothing about, realized that it was incredibly dangerous, no place to raise a child, sent him back to his grandparents who he didn't know in Hawaii, came back to Hawaii, and then left him again to go off to do her PhD thesis field work in Indonesia again. He'd had enough of this. So as a teenager, was really on his own. He doesn't really talk about his mother a whole lot. A lot of, obviously, love and warmth and affection, but there's a sense of pain there too, which he rarely, rarely discusses with anyone. And he willed himself into being. He willed himself into being by reading, by finding whatever mentors he could. But he sort of narrated and wrote a new character of himself, which is why I come back in the book to the importance of the one writer who stands out for him is Malcolm X. And Malcolm X actually didn't write his own book. It was written by Alex Haley, who himself wove together fiction and non-fiction, as Obama does in his really powerful first book, his Dreams from My Father. That quality of creating yourself, of narrating your own story and disciplining yourself into something different is something he'd use as a politician all the time. The discipline, the drive, the desire to be your own storyteller is very strong in him. And I think you have to understand that to see, well, why doesn't he do more? Why doesn't he just let something rip as a liberal or let the emotion fly? Well, he spent his life creating this disciplined character for himself. And this may be a stretch of a comparison, but look, Bush in some ways had to do the same with himself. He had to recreate himself as a 40-year-old, to give up alcohol and put himself on a track towards politics. You have to have this unique drive to want to do this insane job or even run for it in the first place and be successful. So to let the discipline crack, to give up on the incrementalism and the caution would be to unwrite the character, to write some different kind of script. And I don't see that yet. Maybe it will happen. I'm not sure it will ever happen.
Don't you think America thought they were electing a guy who was going to do it?
I think some parts of America did, yes. But if you take him at his word in the 2004 speech, if you think this is someone who is going to unite red and blue America, then he's a figure of compromise. What happened was that people on the left, because of his opposition to the war, thought that he was a real liberal. They were electing the liberal ideal, and he was African American, so that it was their ideal brought to life. And in fact, the reason he reached the independent voters who took him over the top was because he was this compromising figure.
Yes, in the corner here, and then we must get somebody from the back. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment a little bit on the your opening remarks when you, I think, said Obama probably is not so much a radical as actually said he's no radical, but I think in the whole conversation that's emerged, actually he is quite radical, I think, in his vision and his appreciation of what needs to change in his society. But he's a tempered radical, and that's temperance, that's ability to actually say what's the discipline, what's the practice of changing a democratic society that's quite ingrained in its views, is what you see, that opaqueness and almost that puzzle about him. Where is he? Who is he exactly? I think that comes out, in my view, in his ability to relate to people like Deleuze or Jeremiah Wright in their views, because one of the key things a person like him would need to succeed will be to appreciate actually the anger in marginalized communities, the anger and despair which are in equal measure, where the people who can change the society are angry and the rest of the people are in despair. And to have the ability to turn complaint into inspiration, because really a complaint and that anger is really a vision turned inside out. You're describing what is not instead of what could be. And so I think it's a little bit naive to then demand of him that wherever he sees that anger, he should withdraw. You go into Jeremiah Wright's church for 20 years, you hear him speak about anger, you pull away, because, I mean, that would be being a politician, and that would lose him the credibility of the people who are angry, who believe that they probably have a right to be angry. I think his success is that discipline, that ability to then be conscious of all that anger and then say, well, how can this look if we wanted to create a better society? And I think the quarantine he had in Hawaii, not being immersed in the heartland of the experiences of many marginalized communities inside the big cities of America, helped a lot. That he learns that anger much later in life, and it's not gone into his DNA the way it's gone into the DNA of many people. I mean, Deleuze, forget Deleuze and Jeremiah Wright. Michelle let slip when she said, for the first time in my life, I'm proud of America. And everybody went at her. That is his wife, right? And so I think what I find very inspiring about him is that ability to hold that radical vision and then learn this discipline of how to bring it to life. And I wanted to put this perspective to you and see how you might react to it.
Well, you raise a number of good points. You call him radical. Look, the thing you're discussing here is what I tried to encapsulate by stealing the Secret Service code name, Renegade. He's a rule breaker. He's unconventional, but he's very cautious and disciplined in how he does that. So the Renegade concept was a useful image for me. But you raise something bigger here, which is that he's a misfit, actually. I remember that I didn't answer your question about me being British and having what's left of my British accent. Mm-hmm. He, as a student, mixed with what he called the, apart from the minority students, the foreigners, the punk rockers, and the communists. There's no question that he relates in some ways. His mother raised him to be a citizen of the world. I mean, talk about the hippie kid. And there's a part of him that is like that, that likes being that sort of eclectic mix, a mutt, as he has called himself. Not just a racial mutt, but, you know, a cultural one. The talent that he has, politically and I think socially, is to weave his story as this outsider into a mainstream story. Is to say, actually, as a community organizer has to, that my story is like your story, and your story is like the person down the block, and we're all in this together. That's a community organizer's trick. That's also a writer's trick, and he does that time and again. That's really quite skillful, because there's nothing really that conventional or mainstream about the way he's been brought up, and that's what the Clinton people thought would actually do him in the end. They never figured out how to use it or to express it in a way that wasn't frankly insulting and faintly racist. That, I think, is the sort of most radical thing that he does in ways. I'm going to hold to that. I don't think his politics are radical. I don't think his ideas are even out of the mainstream for democratic politics. But The radical idea is that you can find this common ground. Now, I don't know that in today's politics that's possible.
Depends what your starting point is. I mean, they are radical if you think about what you consider to be mainstream presidential behavior. And you could say the speech in Cairo was radical.
Well, I absolutely agree with that.
That is radical. That is something you could never imagine any American president in history saying.
I'm not sure you could imagine any Western leader saying other than him. Yeah, no, I think that speech was actually dramatic and had a reach that other presidents just haven't had.
But you also said he wrote it.
There was a huge amount of input. No, he didn't write all of it, but he extensively rewrote it himself. Absolutely true. And he'd been thinking about those themes and what he wanted to say for a very long time. He was ridiculed through the campaign for being naive enough to even consider this, because he floated this repeatedly, and thought that he would be able to connect with the Muslim world in a way that others hadn't. That actually did come to pass. What effect it has, I think it's still too early to tell.
At the very back, why not?
Bit rogue, but is his opponent in 2012 going to be Sarah Palin, do you think?
Well, she would like to think so. Actually, first of all, she would like to make money. I think that's become very clear. It was clear at the time. It's all the more clear now that her former soon-to-be son-in-law has been saying that's what she said around the kitchen table. I think she really... look, I remember I think it was 2000, watching Dan Quayle try to put his campaign together. And he was someone who had been vice president. And it was ludicrous. The track record of failed vice presidential candidates isn't good, no matter what their profile. Joe Lieberman floundered. John Edwards actually did a reasonable job but won absolutely nothing. So it's not good. She will get a very solid 10% vote. She'll get a very solid 30% vote of the Republican Party. But, and in some states, she may even win with that 30%, a very motivated base with a low turnout. But it won't be enough to get her the nomination nationwide in the party. So I don't think she will be. I think that the Republicans will go for someone... Look, they're going to be going against an incumbent president. And if they have an opening at all, it will be because of the economy. I could see them much more likely going for Mitt Romney, someone with a business background, who has been a governor, who can take on, in a safe way, a sitting president. Having said that, Sarah Palin represents this inchoate anger that is actually very real and quite a significant force, I suspect, everywhere, and certainly in America right now. I can see a third-party candidate coming through, a sort of combination of Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan, possibly an anchor on Fox News, someone who can sort of do the rabble-rousing, mob-driven, nativist, kick out illegal immigrants, let's beat down this socialist president, and we'll actually have quite terrifying campaign events, which will be endlessly entertaining and shocking in equal measure. So I don't think it will be Sarah Palin, though, actually. I think it's going to be someone outside politics. She's already inside the party.
John.
Do you share the view that he is overexposed in the media? The furor that erupted after the Henry Louis Gates affair, and there was a lot being said that he needs to be quiet and needs not to intervene in every controversy that erupts, that there's a danger in playing him too often.
I don't think he's overexposed. I think it's hard to overexpose a president. The Gates thing was interesting because that was one of the rare flashes of his humor, actually. He does have a sense of humor. He just doesn't crack jokes that often. But that was one time when he did, and the joke was, you know, if I try to break into the White House, I get shot. It was racial humor, too. A double no-no. But that's him. That's really who he is. That's the thing that gets kept under lock and key.
And got the sucker.
I don't think he's overexposed in the media. I think he's overextended with policy, actually. I think they're just trying to do too many things too quickly. And maybe that leads to being overexposed because you have to explain all the things you're trying to do. But, you know, in the week they unveiled their budget, they also rolled out their plans for withdrawal in Iraq. I said to one senior White House person, did you have to do both in the same week? Could you not have waited on maybe the Iraq thing? The budget has its own timetable, but Iraq too? And they were going, well, you know, that's what we have to do. We just have to do everything immediately. In an economic crisis, yes. I just don't know that. Healthcare was supposed to be a priority for the first term, not the first year. I think there's been a rush, and I think that's spooked people.
I want to take just a little group of questions because we're sort of getting towards the... So I'm going to ask you first.
No mention's been made this evening of what power he might have over the expansion of the settlements in Israel.
Yes.
Is he going to have any more luck than his predecessors in actually being able to put his foot down there and control the Jewish lobby?
I am told... I don't quite like the term Jewish lobby, but let me set that aside for a moment. I'm told that they think, there was a report in The Guardian, I think it was last week, that the deal had been done and all of it. It's not quite done, and this is the beginning of a process, a peace process, not the peace process. But that beginning of a beginning is premised on a significant step on settlements, and some measure, this is all to establish the bona fides of both sides, and some measure on security from the Palestinians. I think it's more likely to be symbolic than anything else. And, but still, the start of a process is quite a dramatic turnaround from the position we were in when he was preparing to move into the White House, and Israel was bombing Gaza, and Netanyahu was about to come in, and you know, nobody thought anything would happen. So the White House is feeling actually fairly positive about this. It is their first year in office. I mean, how many White Houses come in feeling fairly positive about what they can do about the Middle East, and it all goes horribly wrong? You know, there was a debate among the pro-Israel lobby, as I might prefer to describe it, about whether settlements, the settlement issue was irrelevant or not. Now, Rahm Emanuel, for all my sort of faint criticism of him today, actually understands the Israeli dynamic very well. And I don't think it's a coincidence. They don't think settlements are the real issue either. But as a statement of goodwill, as an establishment of trust, it's been important and relatively easy for some in Israel to deliver. So I think it's not going to be all settlements. You're going to end up in a definitional argument about what a settlement is, what's a suburb of Jerusalem, effectively. So is it outpost settlements, natural growth, not? I think there will be some movement, but it's not the core issue. It's just to say they have some goodwill and can get back to some negotiating position.
Richard, I'm going to shorten you into MSNBC, well, perhaps even NBC gobbets,
yes,
so that I can take a lot of quick questions.
I'll keep it very brief. Yes.
So let's start here. Yes. Yeah.
There was a picture came out recently of Obama in the Oval Office with one of his daughters hiding behind the sofa. And this has been compared, of course, to a picture of Kennedy in a similar situation. To what extent do you think he personally identifies with Kennedy, and does he identify with anyone, really?
I always thought those comparisons were ridiculously overblown until actually Ted Kennedy got involved in the campaign, and people started circulating books about Bobby Kennedy's campaign, and the pictures looked surprisingly similar. And he said that there were people in the crowd when he got Ted Kennedy's endorsement that reminded him of both Kennedy campaigns because of the look on the faces of the young people. So every Democrat aspires to it. He's probably got closer to it than anyone.
Yeah, yes.
has Obama read your book? And if he has, to what degree would he agree with your account that you've given of him here tonight?
As far as I know,
the publisher would like you to think yes.
He stole a copy of a book that one of his aides was reading out loud on Air Force One. They were dramatically reenacting a scene in the book. He stole it from them and started leafing through it. When one of them told me what he'd done, I realized that I actually hadn't given him a copy. So I got a copy to him. I don't know if he's read it. His senior staff have told me that it's accurate. So that's all I can say.
Right at the back there.
Just curious what your view is on his view of climate change and how serious he is about it.
He is very serious about it. Is he? How much of a priority is it over healthcare, Afghanistan, the Guantanamo detention, interrogation issues, the economy? You know, it's going to fall off the list as it has done before, but look, he thought he could deliver more at the last G8, and he couldn't. But they are serious about Copenhagen, about the next round, about green technologies, about having incentives to actually make this a real part of the American economy. And look how they've structured the reformed American car industry. It's almost entirely around small, fuel-efficient cars. That's all that's going to be left of the American car industry. That's why Fiat was able to move in the way it's done. So that's pretty serious. But are any of these politicians actually really delivering on their fine rhetoric on climate change? I would argue not. He is. I mean, it's a huge contrast from Bush. It really is. Now, Bush towards the end was softening, but he still had a long way to go. So we start off in a different position.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if you could perhaps say a word about racial relations in the post-Obama era, and in particular, I'm fascinated with how Obama managed to win over quite a large segment of the Hispanic community, which in some states traditionally had been very opposed to Democrats for particular reasons, how he managed to convince a very skeptical black electorate as well, who was not so keen on Obama at first. And then also I wonder if you could maybe give us an insight into how he's trying to reach out to that angry white male or to the hockey mom that Sarah Palin so clearly targets.
The Latino vote was really squandered by Republicans. Their position on immigration was so offensive that and Democrats were making so many moves on immigration that I think serious Republicans now believe that they've lost the Latino vote for many decades, so which is demographically a huge problem for them. How he got African Americans to back him was by winning in Iowa, pure and simple. I mean, his numbers turned around after that. When they believed that he could actually win, they were deeply skeptical of him. Angry white voters, I suspect, are actually lost cause too. They disproportionately watch Fox News, which is relentlessly hostile to him. I don't think there's any way of turning that around, honestly. He's going to have a really hard core against him, and some of it's going to be violent. I mean, the security threats against him are real. Now, the Secret Service now treats presidents like they are military assets. So, you know, a lot of the fears about his safety, I think, date back to a time when presidents were much more open. In a post 9/11 world, really, presidents are under intense threats all the time. So, I don't have any particular fears about that. But the kinds of language that's being used is extremely provocative. Now, you know, Latino voters, I actually think Latino voters were trending Democratic anyway. But if he doesn't deliver on normalizing the status of illegals, I don't think it's going to make any difference. I think Republicans are so fringy on this issue now that it's almost impossible to see how Republicans can get younger Latino voters back.
Final 5 minutes. I want to try and get 5 questions in. Yes.
I'll keep them even briefer.
Sorry, following on from your point about how the Glenn Becks and the Rush Limbaughs and the Tom Tancredas, et cetera, have totally alienated Hispanic voters from the GOP for possibly decades, and given the demographic shift that is underway, is there a future for the Republican Party in America?
Again, it's going to come back to the economy if they have a short-term future. If they can portray themselves as the real the voice of reform, if they can pull off they hope they can pull off a 1994 again. I think the memories are too recent for the Democrats to fall into that trap. They will lose seats, but it won't be a wipeout like '94. How do they get that back? Well, the challenge for Republicans is to be more than a regional party in the Old South. The challenge for the media in America is to recognize that the Old South is just one region, as opposed to some kind of cultural core of what it means to be American. And I had this debate with my editors. Look, I'm a foreigner, so either I've got wonderful insight or I'm a complete idiot. But I had this debate through. Obama was not winning the white vote in Appalachia among Democrats. And my constant refrain with my Newsweek editors at the time, I've now since left Newsweek, it was, why do Appalachian voters, white voters in Appalachia, mean more to you than white voters in Oregon or Wisconsin? And they could never answer it. There is a cultural image of certain parts of the country that matter to people, especially on the East Coast. And I suppose we carry some of that in Britain too, because you know, certain regions have characteristics. People in my hometown of Birmingham are supposed to be stupid or uncultured. And so, you know, it's hard to overcome some of those cultural images. And but the Republicans themselves have to realize that the Old South, it may be culturally important, but is not enough.
Yes, in the striped shirt in the corner. And then we'll take one more here, and I think probably that will be all we can do.
Just going back to Reverend Wright, and you were speaking about him earlier, I just wonder, to what extent do you think Obama is actually a religious man? Is it something that all American politicians have to just say, yes, I go to church, yes, I'm a Christian? Or do you think he does actually have a core element of faith that's actually a tangible part of it?
His mother, again, the sort of hippie anthropologist, loved the sort of cross-cultural spirituality of myths and spiritualism. He decided that her life, her wandering life, wasn't for him. Reverend Wright represented identity, community, a fixed place. And by the way, he was an expert storyteller. All of those things were compelling to him, and all of those things have almost nothing to do with Christian faith. Now, they have something very strongly to do with a black church, actually. Not that the black church has little to do with faith, far from it, but Wright's message was about community action and self-improvement. And the United Church of Christ, which he's a part of, is, by the way, white denomination. Big black church in a white denomination is actually pretty hippie. I mean, they strum guitars, and it's what we would call happy clappy. And I think for many evangelical Christians, that isn't really, that's not religion. So I think he actually is closer to his mother than he would politically admit.
And finally, one question here.
Hello. Do you think that as a result of the events that followed the Iranian elections, Obama doesn't have the appetite now for diplomacy with the Iranian leadership?
Good question. Again, recent conversation I had with the White House, they said, well, we understand all of that, but there are There are very interesting things going on with the Supreme Leader, and which we can't fully reveal, but there's something happening here that we don't fully understand, but suggests that the regime in its totality is struggling to find a way out. Whether that's genuine, whether it leads to anything at the UN General Assembly or later, they'll wait and see. But there is a real desire, of all the policy wonkish things that Obama loves, the nuclear issue is one that he has carried with him from his days as a student at Columbia University through the Senate. One of the few substantive things he did in the Senate was about dealing with loose nukes. And I think he'll try to keep that one alive no matter how much backsliding Tehran does.
Well, what a tour d'horizon. On your behalf, I would really like to thank Richard very, very warmly.